This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Good morning, true seekers and true crime junkies. Welcome back to another episode of Hit the Road Jack, Finding the Zodiac. Today, I am here with Nolan Del Campo again as we cover the handwriting presentation. We're close to the end, you guys. I know you've been sticking it out with me. We're at the V's, or at least that's where we left off last week. Let's go ahead and welcome in Nolan. Good morning. All right, we're getting there. We're at the V's. That means just a few more letters. We'll do some punctuation and be back to the Zodiac cases, which will be exciting. Last week we left off on the V's, and I think I still had just a few of them to cover, to go over. So I'm going to step back into that if you don't mind. We'll go full screen. So basically, we were talking about the construction of V's that Jack has, and he has some very angular V's. He tends to uplift the right arm of that V very high into the air, typically towards the right, and it is much taller than the left arm of that V. Now, as we travel down some of his V's, we can see that he does have some curvatures in it off to the right here. Here's more of that visualization. This one seems to be a little bled out on the top portion, but we can see that curvature in that right arm, but it is still much taller than the left side. He also tends to have a rightward lean on that V in many cases. And then we climb on over into what looks like a horseshoe U instead of an actual V, but he crisscrosses like we spoke about last week. With his U's, he has some V-shaped U's, and with his V's, he has some U-shaped V's. So keeping that in mind, we're going to go through the rest of the V's from where we stopped last time. So looking back at the Black Dahlia, we see this very blunt V, very heavy inked V. We see that a lot throughout these, especially in the Sacramento letter, in the Scorpion letters, and in the John Benet Ramsey letters. We did see some of the heavier inked V's, but they were more copybook in the Zodiac Killer. But we can see that he does move back and forth in the Zodiac between U-shaped and V-shaped, not to mention this particular one here that has a thin left arm, a right side that is not necessarily complete, but we can see that the ink is much thicker and stops short of the completion of that arm. And that I found was consistent with Sherry Jo Bates. The overall appearance is pretty much the same. In the Fairfield letter, we had, I almost refer to him as a bird-shaped V because he has used a curvature on both sides. And in doing so, it gives you that appearance of a hand-drawn bird on a piece of paper. Now, when I looked at those, I started to find those in other places, such as the Voinovich letter in let's see, we found that in the D.B. Cooper. I'm also going to refer to it kind of as a check mark V because it kind of looks more like a check mark than it does. Wouldn't you say, Nolan?
Yes.
So the checkmark V is something that is very, very consistent throughout as well. And we see that in the D.B. Cooper letters here. We can also see where these actually cross-reference to, again, these down here in Voinovich with that checkmark appearance because the right-hand side is curved over. We also have what I refer to as the very tall copybook V. Once again, that one is consistent throughout. So evidently, one of the disguises for the V is making it look extremely tall and skinny. And we can see that between the Lipstick Killer, we found it in the Sorry Mary letter. Let's see, the
Scorpion.
dear, what's that? This? Yes, absolutely. In the Scorpion right there. Anthrax contained one. Tim Miller's letter contained one. We found them in the Albany, New York letter. And in fact, the Dear Draft Board letter also had a version of it, but it does have a slight curvature, as we were talking about with some of these other ones. So it's almost as if he is manipulating it in the opposite direction of his normal, of course, in order to make that attempted disguise. The Zodiac Killer had both the U-shaped V's along with the copybook V's and these very small V's. We're going to see these as well throughout. Let's see where I found some of those. I found them in the Scorpion letters. I found them in the Sacramento letter. I found it in the Voinovich letter. These ones are smaller, obviously, than the more tall, skinny one, but again, relative, obviously, in shape, size. And of course, the D.B. Cooper letter, again, also used that very tall V. And then we had a square-shaped V, which I don't think I've ever tried to imagine doing square writing, but I don't know that in square writing you would actually make the V square. What do you think, Nolan?
That's odd. Let's get a little wastebasket.
Right? I think that in square writing, you probably wouldn't have manipulated that letter at all. You would have kept it in its natural form because, like you said, you changed the appearance of what that letter is by making that bottom portion squared off. Either way, as we move on through Albany, New York, we had, again, those tall, skinny V's like we had in Lipstick Killer. In fact, the impression of those are very, very similar to Lipstick. And one U-shaped V was found. And that U-shaped V has that curvature on the right-hand side that we see Jack carries up there. And in the Citizen letter, we had primarily these more rounded shaped V's, but we can again see that these are extremely consistent with Jack's, which is why they're marked in blue. Channel 9 newsletter had both the small V's, the tall, skinny V, and then more of an angular base. But just remember, everybody, everything that is marked with a star, oops, that star is supposed to be on the Zodiac Killer. Everything that is marked with a star is actually written by the Zodiac, has already been confirmed by Department of Justice handwriting experts. So realistically speaking, I am merely, and I've made the identification between Jack and the Zodiac Killer. So I am just looking at other letters in other series of crimes or serial killings across the United States and the communications that accompanied those crimes and how those disguises actually match up to those other letters. So climbing into the OCCK, we can see the use of both the horseshoe, and again, that horseshoe shaped U right there is consistent with many of the other horseshoe shaped U's that we're finding in, like, so say over here in Albany, New York, we've got that curvature on the right side. We do see that the right arm of these V's, I'm sorry, I called it a U. The right side of these V's are actually, again, taller than the left side. And then it moves into angular V's. So again, we're seeing this flip-flop back and forth between the use of both styles. In the Herb Cain, we had that very short V that we just got done talking about. And we see it again in Herb Cain with a more rounded version over here on the right-hand side. And that leads us right on into Atlanta, Georgia, where once we talked about that small V, and then we talked about the tall, skinny V. Again, another very similar appearance to the Albany letter, to the Lipstick Killer letters. The Atlanta, Georgia, we could see that he was heavily manipulating or attempting to disguise his V's. We see all of these extracurricular tremors. This one almost appears more like a W than it does a V, but that just lends us to the fact that he is manipulating and disguising his handwriting. And of course, we do have one good solid V out of that, that again is consistent with other V's, such as in the Zodiac's realm. The Sacramento letter in 1986, again, had the smaller V's, but we had that thick, heavy appearance of the V, which is probably attributed to the pen that the individual used, which we know Zodiac's favorite pen was a Pilot Razor pen, which is a felt tip pen. And it can give a heavier it leaves heavier amounts of ink, so that would be likely as to why we're seeing these being so thick and almost fuzzy or muddy. Moving into the Scorpion letters, as Nolan had stated, we have the V that is the copybook V that was used both in Zodiac and many other of the communications. But then we get down into these Vs again that look extremely similar to the Sacramento letter. This one right here is just pretty much dead on in my mind about size, shape, slant. Thickness, of course, again, it appears the same type of utensil was used or pen was used. And then we have the smaller Vs, the more shorter V's that we saw over here in Atlanta, Georgia. JonBenet Ramsey was full of the checkmark V's. So that we spoke about obviously up here earlier on in the DB Cooper. But when we get over into the end of the letter per se, we start to see these ones with curvatures both on the left and right hand side of the arms. And again, that is consistent with the curvatures that we saw on the Deer draft board in the attempt to make that curve as a disguise in the Fairfield letter. So it is a continuing disguise. We also see a very strict angular V, but we also see a U-shaped V. So again, and that one is very consistent with Jack's U-shaped V's.
Once again, the JonBenet looks like a 3-year-old wrote them.
Right. Yeah, that shakiness. I mean, obviously, and when I think of a 3-year-old, I mean, I think of somebody scribbling and it's not really legible writing. When I think of someone beginning to write, say, as my granddaughter, who is she's now in 1st grade, so she's been writing for a couple years now. But when she started writing, we had more or less the circle, the round of the circle was round. It wasn't tremorous or full of tremors and looking. To me, this is almost like somebody who has deteriorated handwriting or somebody who is suffering from some type of outside influence or neurological disease where it causes the hand to shake. Yeah. Right. So while my granddaughter was performing, these letters, they were literally round and they might not be perfectly round, but they were round and they were minus tremor. So I look at it a little bit, I suppose in some cases when we look at bad handwriting or handwriting that doesn't seem to be as well developed or mature, one could say that that's a childlike writing for sure. I do look at some adults' handwriting who haven't practiced it heavily through their life, and it does look like they have 4th or 5th grade writing. So carrying on with Voinovich, again, we talked about the checkmark V's. Those are present. We also talked about the V's with the curved right side. Those are present. And we also have the small V's that we see, such as in Anthrax, which also contains that tall V again, just like, I mean, that one, while it is slanted to the right just a tiny bit, it is just the form, the shape, and the spacing between the two arms are just very, very consistent with one another. When I moved into Tom Voigt, no surprise, we had both U-shaped V's and the angular-shaped V's, and they all lean pretty much to the right as we see, which is consistent with what we see in Jack's handwriting. We already spoke about Tim Miller. We had the small V's and the tall skinny V. And then in the Bruce Ivans, we had again these U-shaped V's that aren't finished off on the right-hand side. And that just took me back up to here in Sherry Jo Bates and in the Zodiac Killer's V's, where it's leaned to the right and he just basically doesn't finish that right-hand bar. And then we had almost what looked like, again, that squiggliness that Nolan was talking about in regards to childlike writing that was more consistent with JonBenet Ramsey in the last V from Bruce Ivans, but we can see that the right arm again is still taller than the left. Now, a lot of people actually do this. So when I talk about these particular perceptions of letters, a lot of people may have the right side taller than the left side, but then the form may be different. So I'm not just stating that the right side being taller than the left side is what makes it an identification or a match to Jack. It just means that it is not dissimilar and it is within the realm of what Jack is doing. And I want to remind everybody that as I'm going through these and talking about the shapes that are consistent within the disguised writing, doesn't necessarily mean that Jack is the author of them either, but I do believe that he should be investigated for those crimes along with the Zodiac Killer cases. All right, moving on to the W's. The W's kind of have, I mean, as we go through them, we can kind of see what's going on, the differences between Jack's. He tends to have the first V shape of the W on the left-hand side tends to be angular, and then as he moves to the right V shape, it is actually more rounded. And we can see that clear here where there's an angularity, and then this right one is actually more rounded off. And as we go through, we can see he has some fat, short, rounded ones, and I pay attention to the way this midsection rises, the direction in which it points, and how these endings of the W on the left and right, or the beginning and the ending of the W arms on the left and right side actually meet up to that midsection. And we're going to talk about that in some of these disguises. Here again, you can see the left angular side, the rounded right side. This one, I found a lot of those throughout the communications. And then we move into, again, some more well-rounded W's. And then I pointed out this little curly Q that he has on the right-hand side of the arm as he exits. He kind of draws inward towards the midsection of the W, leaving a slight curly Q, or sometimes it's just a heavy dot like we see up here in that one. We do see that at times he can actually make a loop in the center of the W. And then we move into a few of the more angular W's that Jack can do. And again, here's another one with that very angular left side with a very rounded right side. Midsection actually leaning to the right and pointing towards the right exit arm. We also saw the angular W, which appears to be small as it begins, but then the final exit stroke of the right side of the arm is very, very high into the sky towards the right, which is what we've talked about, how he leaves off a lot of his letters. The right side always tends to be much taller and longer than the left side. We have some just plain old angular small W's, and then we have some that actually almost kind of reminded me of his capital letter ends, but these were definitely W's that I found, and we can see that these curvatures move back up. We can see the heavy period dotting that's up there. And we can see this heavy curvature in the right side arm of the W. So now moving into Lipstick, Lipstick actually had some extremely interesting formations for their W's. He literally used two V's, crossed them to make the actual W. And in the second W of the Lipstick killing case, we can see the curvature of those V's. And now that was extremely consistent with what we saw back there in regards to those curved V's in the Dear Draft Board letters. So he's applied two V's together, crossing them in the center and giving it that appearance of two V's overlapping each other. And of course, I found that in the Tim Miller letter. So right down here at the very bottom, we can see that he has used once again that particular version of two V's overlapping each other. I did not find that to be a coincidence, because I said the finale letter contained evidence or some type of clue that he was responsible for all of the crimes that we're discussing. So if that letter is to be taken seriously, and it is true, then I would suspect that this particular W was the outlying piece of information that connected it back to the Lipstick Killer. When I moved into the Elizabeth Short, I found that the W's ranged from both angular and small to rounded bottom humps, which are consistent as we move back and forth between Jacks, but we can actually see in some of these movements, the thinness of those bottom humps of the W are very consistent with the thinness that we see in Jacks. And this need to actually make the angular points of the W at the bottom so close together that it gives it kind of well, it's hard to explain that portion of the letter. Let's just go here. So looking at this one, we can look over here at the DB Cooper W. He did it again here. So basically this very, very small, close together bottom valleys of the W, very close together with very wide spreading arms, that even then that wide spreading arm is taller on the right hand side. And we can see that that one is much more consistent with obviously what is going on in Jack's handwriting. In the Sorry Mary letter, I found that he was using almost that four-stroke construction that he used in the capital letter M back when we looked at the M's, but I did find that there were four-stroke construction W's in the disguised communications. I'm looking for that now. And of course, where the midsection actually comes all the way up and meets up and is squared off with the arms. We're going to see those as we go through. The werewolf killer, the Kern werewolf letter, I actually found that there was not only W's that had the first bottom hump that was angular, but the second one that was curved, like we discussed about Jack. And then I found these extremely strange ones that look like kind of a roller coaster ride, the way that they are actually formed. And when I moved down into, let's say, the Atlanta, Georgia killer, I found the exact same type of construction that was being used. So again, I just go back to, do we have multiple serial killers that idealize disguising letters in the same fashion, or are we really dealing with the same killer over 60 years? Moving into the right side of the Kern letter, we see more of these shorter W's, but again, we have the size of the mid zone and the left and right arm of the W are actually capping out, making it look more square and flush. One is not higher or taller than the other, but we do see that that is being used actually in some things like the Fairfield letter, where the midsection is just as tall as the left and right hand side. So those were consistent from Kern to Fairfield. We even seen some of that happening in the Oswald letter. So here again, we have that first side of the W that is angular, and then it moves into the curved side. Now we see that these particular W's that are found in Oswald are extremely consistent with not only the Dear Draft Board letters, the Fairfield letters, let's see, the DB Cooper letters, letter W's, all of these are consistent back and forth if you just go back and forth between these circled W's and look at them. Moving into the Sherry Joe Bates, I found this very shallow center. So the arms are much taller and the midsection actually stops very short, but that is definitely, and again, that makes it look kind of like a bird. Do you see that? Does that look like a bird too? Like somebody wrote a bird. So it's very shallow. The right and left arms do not move up, and the midsection is extremely shallow. And as we go through many of these, we'll start to see again in the Dear Draft Board letter, we have the shallow versions where the midsection does not rise all the way up. That is exactly the disguise he attempts to use when he makes these copybook W's. Again, very shallow midsections. The midsection does not rise up. We can see in these other haphazardly written W's that there is a bit more to that midsection, but we can actually then go back and see that those are very consistent with what Jack does, including that long arm on the right-hand side that veers off. Here's one that's a little more consistent, obviously, I felt with the W in Jack's writing. We also found in the Zodiac Killer case this heavy dotting or this curling to the inside. We can see the curling to the inside on this one in the Zodiac as well. And this shape actually of the W found in the Zodiac was very consistent with the shape that I showed you up here in Jack's handwriting. So the Zodiac writing has a lot of similarities, including the rounded shaped W's that are similar in form and shape to what Jack does.
The curved W's look more natural. The angular W's look fake.
Right. Yeah. When he does those, it's definitely, he's putting an effort to make it that straight and that angular, because it looks to me like he primarily uses more of a, if it does have an angular side, say like this W over here, it's more of a rounded angular. It's not a sharp pointed angular like we see in that W there. So, and then that right side continues on into a curved fashion. So his definite choice, I mean, albeit when we look through here, primarily he uses a rounded W, not an angular V shape.
I have a template of my own handwriting, my roster for my Madden football team. So I've got 54 different names. And my W's are always curved, and I have the little hook on the right top. you could spot my W's in a minute.
That's what I ask everybody to do when I talk about how these things are formed and shaped. I mean, look at yours and see how yours differ. The differences that you find in yours are likely what's going to cause an exclusion of you as being the author of these letters. Here, I'm showing you that all of what we're talking about is actually within the range and realm of what Jack's doing, and the disguised ones are anticipated disguise because he uses that the least amount. I mean, when I look for these angular W's, I really only found about 3 or 4 out of maybe 10, 15, more than 10 or 15 W's, but I only found 3 or 4. So the go-to for him for a disguise would obviously be this angular notion, because he doesn't want people to see what he believes is his normal W, even though he does actually do these angular strokes himself. Getting into the Dear Draft Board letter, I found that the continuation of the left side being angular, the right side being curved, and also this midsection that actually reaches over and almost touches the right arm of the actual W is what I was talking about, that particular midsection over here in Jack's, where it actually leans to the right, and then the curvature of the right arm coming back makes them almost like they're going to touch up in the center or complete maybe even an O. Was kind of what was going on in my mind. But we do see the rounded, very shallow midsection W's that we've been talking about. Let's see. Here we get into more even more shallow W's in the Fairfield letters, which again are very consistent as we cross-reference those back and forth between the Dear Draft Board. Let's see who else we had in there. Oh, SLA also had that very strange roller coaster U, where he made the midsection rounded instead of a V shape. And we talked about that in the Atlanta, Georgia letters and in the Kern letter. So we see that happening in 3 different communications. And now we know that for sure it is a part of what's going on in the Zodiac's handwriting, because the SLA letter was written by the Zodiac. Let's see. The DC Freeway Phantom W's. Now, I find that these ones have the most difference between any of the other W's that we're looking at. Like to me, they show not a completely different, but obviously we still have the left side that is angular that moves into the right side that is rounded. We do have the right side that is lifted up higher in the air than the left side. So there are some consistencies along with that rightward lean. So I circled that more or less just to say that it does have some consistency with what was going on. And we did find that many of the letters in the DC Freeway Phantom were consistent with the disguised writings, but I do find that the DC Freeway Phantom letter has the most dissimilarities in overall appearance. In DB Cooper, again, we see the square W's. I had nothing in Jack's realm to be able to match that, but we did have this particular W, the very angular with the very shallow midsection, V-shaped or triangle shaped, V-shaped bottom portion, which is very consistent with Jack's writing up here. We also, in the DB Cooper, found these rounded ones, these bubbly rounded ones, which were not only consistent with the Dear Draft Board, they're consistent with Jack's. And as I go through here, I mean, these are just very consistent with many of the W's that we're looking at. And then we moved into some that had the angular portion, but then had that curved midsection, which is what we talked about going on in the Kern in Atlanta, Georgia. So we know that his attempt to disguise includes a rounded midsection of the W. We had the shorter angular W that was found. Let's see, I have that one in the Herb Cain letters. So DB Cooper did have some consistency with the short angular W's there. The Albany, New York, it goes back and forth. Once again, we see the rounded W's that I have notated are consistent with both the Fairfield letters. It's DB Cooper, on and on. There's just so many consistencies. And then we move into some that are rounded, some that are angular. The right bar, again, is reaching high into the sky. And then we have the W's that to me look like an upside down M, because the midsection rises completely to the level of the left and right arm. And that is consistent with the Sorry Mary letters. We already covered SLA. The citizen letter with this very shallow midsection, again, is consistent with what we were seeing happen in the Fairfield letters. Again, written by the same person. We know that. Again, the far-reaching right arm of the W itself. But again, when we go through the Channel 9 newsletters, all happen to be far more angular, but we do see that at some point he slipped up and started to do that more rounded version that we are used to seeing. And moving into the Red Phantom letter, that one having the far-reaching arm, again, very consistent with what we've been talking about. So we have the shallow midsection, far-reaching arm, and again, written by the Zodiac. So we do anticipate to see those similarities. I think that, again, here, this particular movement is very similar to what the Zodiac did in one of the W's, and that we saw that Jack did in the W's as well. So that movement of the very short left arm up into the midsection with the far-reaching, heavily curved right section. And it's also leaning, again, to the right. The Oakland County child murder W's, again, I'm not finding any differences with these. Again, you guys, they're very consistent with the disguise of the Fairfield letters. If you look at these W's here, you can see that that's consistent. The final W has not only the angular left side, but the rounded right side that we've been talking about. Herb Cain had kind of a mix between both the angular and the rounded, but again, we can cross-reference those back and forth and say, yes, indeed, that was written by the Zodiac based on the fact that we had two styles used, and those two styles are very consistent with other known sources and samples of writing. In the Atlanta, Georgia, we had the angular version, we have the rounded version, we have where the midsection rises all the way to the top from the left to the right, which is again consistent with other W's that we've talked about, such as in OCCK or any of the other ones where you see that the disguise was to lift that midsection straight up to the level of the left and right arm. The Sacramento ones are a little bit harder to see. They're a little bit more muddier, but we can definitely make out left side is a V shape, right side is a curvature. And then, of course, we had some other consistencies with other known W's throughout. Scorpion did use both. This one has a V shape on the first, a curvature on the right. He did use the copybook W's, which I felt were consistent with the attempt to disguise, obviously, the writing into something a little more perfect. And we see that up here in Elizabeth Short. Let's see where else we found these guys. I think these are the lowercase ones, so they are a bit different. These attempt to be a little more perfect, but we can see the other W's throughout, some rounded, some angular, and again, the appearance very similar between this wide left and right arm is very similar to what we're seeing going on in the Herb Cain letters. In that JonBenet Ramsey, there we go with that shaky 90-year-old writing again. One of the things I noted here was, again, the very, very low middle zone, the very shortened midsection. Sometimes it's not even apparent. It's not even there. But the idea here, obviously, is to reduce that midsection for whatever reason. And as we look at Jack's, he tends to have a rather tall one. It almost meets up with the left and right arm on nearly every single one. So reducing it down into something shallow as a disguise is probably where somebody would go with that if they were trying to make it look unlike something like what Jack does up here. When I moved into Voinovich, again, we found that same type of construction with the very small middle zone, the very long right and left arms. As we went through, it looks like there was almost a switch up where now the first hump is rounded, the second one is angular, although we do have two here that are completely angular, and we can see once again where that switches back and forth between them. But then we did find one final one down here that had more of an angular left side and the rounded right side that we've been talking about. Getting into the anthrax letters, we find again some more of these more perfect style where the midsection is brought all the way up to match along the length of the arms, which I found that was kind of consistent with some of these others that we saw over here in D.B. Cooper in the Albany, New York, is pretty much the way he attempted to do that by bringing that midsection all the way up to match the level of the left and right arms. In the Tom Voigt W's, we had, they are very similar in appearance to Jack's W's. This entire row of them, all of them are very consistent with the shape, the height of the midsection, the right arm that is lifted, the lean to the right. And then, of course, we had some taller ones with the flailing right arm that is consistent with other W's that are found within this presentation. And then we did talk about, once again, the finale letter. So the finale letter with these copybook W's where the midsection rises all the way atop to the left and right arm again, that is definitely consistent with what we've seen going on over here in Anthrax and that W that we talked about in John Benet Ramsey. Where are we at? 7:35. We're not doing bad.
Great.
Right. What's that?
We're going fast today.
I was hoping that we'd get through. Hopefully, we'll see. We have X, Y, and Z. Now, Y is a pretty big slide, but the X's and Z's, as you know, aren't used a lot in writing. So those are going to move by really quickly. So the X, obviously, we have two straight lines that make an X. And what could be told from this as far as an identification factor is basically I mapped out the slants of the crossbars that make that X, and obviously the width between the top portion of what I would call the arms, the width of the bottom portions that I would call the legs, and the size of the left or right leg in connection to one another. So when I went through Jack's, I found that in many cases, where did my cursor go? There you are. I found that he had a right leg that was shorter than the left leg, and that kept popping up very consistent with these particular X's. It looks as though while this one appears shorter on the left-hand side, if I was to put a line underneath that, it actually is kind of reaching at about the same level as the right leg. So he can do flush where the left is at the same height, but typically speaking, the right tends to be a little bit shorter. When I climbed into the Elizabeth Short writings, again, I found that same attribute. The left leg was longer than the right leg, and the right leg was lifted up above the baseline. And that happened several times in the Elizabeth Short X's. I also mapped out the slant of the, I can't call them right or left, but you can see the straight line that slants to the right, the actual slant and the levelness of that is consistent. So I mapped out these two here with Jack, and I laid it across one on Oswald, very consistent, one on the Channel 9 newsletter, very consistent. And noting that in these particular X's that I did that, the straight line that slants to the right is longer than the straight line that slants to the left. And we can see that leg again is lifted there. The leg again in Channel 9 is lifted there. So in Oswald and in the Channel 9 newsletter, we had not only the same slant of these two crossbars, but we had basically the same attributes going on, with one side being shorter than the other. And then that initial bar that is slanted to the right happens to be much longer than the one that slants to the left. And that was consistent throughout all three. Also focusing on the fact that the width between the arms of the V or of the X is thinner at the top and wider at the bottom. So that was some of the things that I picked up and pointed out here. We had the arms that were thinner, space between those two, and wider at the bottom. That happened in several of them, such as the Scorpion letters, and in the let's see, the finale letter is kind of more perfect with the exception of that one right there. But we can see that perfection that is attempted to crisscross them at a perfect level so that it almost looks like an X mark that one would put inside of a box. And
I think that the perfect X's are attempts to disguise.
Correct.
Really
correct.
neutral. They're really neutral.
Right. Yeah, because we would expect to see something more like this. And then, of course, we do have some where this bar that slants to the right for Jack is actually curved. And I found lots of curvatures on that right slant bar in several of these as well. So I notated them right here. We can see it happening in Tom Voight's. We can see it happening in the Zodiac Killers right there, in the Fairfield letter right there from the Zodiac. So again, we did have some consistencies with the X's. It wasn't as if one was starkly different, or say that he made the left bar longer than the right bar. That is not something that I'm seeing in here. It is always just as Jack does it, basically. We can also see between the Fairfield letter, this particular X is so thin you almost can't decipher the legs and the arms from it. But look at that in the Albany letter, we see pretty much a very similar trait there, where the legs on the bottom are very, very close together, albeit the top is a little bit more spaced out. Let's see, that's the Dear Draft Board letter X. Again, it kind of reminds me of that closed up, like one of those accordion type coffee cup holders from back in the day, Nolan. You remember those things? Mm-hmm. So as if they closed that X up and and brought those bars probably more close together from the top and the bottom. Well, not a lot more that we could say there on the X's, and that will bring us into the Y's, which I notate on Jack's Y's that he has an extremely long right stem stroke with the tail of the Y, and he has a very, very short left-hand arm. And sometimes that left-hand arm is not attached actually to his Y. So we see a space where it doesn't actually connect. We also have this extremely funky looking little one. And I talk about the funky little one because that's some of the disguised ones that we find. We do see that he has a curvature, a slight curvature to the right stem of the Y. And we see that happening in several of them. Here's another one that is not connected, actually. So we have 3 Ys that are not connected, where the arm is not actually connected to the right stem. Now, when I got into the lipstick killing case, I actually found what I called those funky Ys that we just talked about right there. So this one here is very consistent with what we found in the lipstick killing case. We found over-exaggerated Y stems. And then we also found this curved version. So as we know, it is typical for Jack to actually make his Y in 2 separate strokes. This one is made in 1 single stroke, using almost the U shape for the top of the Y. And then, of course, the extended tail of that Y comes down. Now, Jack actually can do this all in 1 stroke. We see it here, only this one looks more angular than rounded. We didn't see anything rounded in Jack's writing, so a rounded Y would be a go-to, and we're going to show you all of those different variations of a rounded Y, but how they're consistent with one another. So when I look at the lipstick killer, I drop down to the DB Cooper here again, not playing with it. It manifested itself pretty much in the same exact way. We have an overextended tail, just like we saw in the lipstick killing case, and we have that rounded U-shaped form, which is very consistent with the form we see in lipstick killer. Another disguise that is attempted throughout is what I call the short Y, where there's almost no tail whatsoever. So it makes it look or appear almost more like a V rather than a Y. We're going to see a lot of those as a disguise through it. So this rounded version with a very or super long tail, or a very short angular Y is what we're looking at. So in the French, the only one that I could really notate here was the consistency between that and the Dear Draft Board, and that is because they made the head separate from the tail. So we have a V, the V is drawn first, and then the tail, the extended length of the tail is added on. We can see that that is actually something that is being done in the Dear Draft Board letters. So with that being said, that is a similarity between the attempted disguise, where we're going to make the head before we make the tail. And not to mention, just like we just discussed, the other form of the Y that is actually very consistent with lipstick. We do have some fanciful Ys that are going on around here as well. Here's another one, actually, I found that was very consistent with Jack's writing. So I've circled that twice. Not only is it consistent with Jack's, but it is consistent with lipstick. So it's got a red circle and a blue circle. Some of these more fanciful ones we are going to take for granted that he absolutely is manipulating his handwriting. But the big bubbly letters, if we all look back to the Sherry Jo Bates letters where we had big bubbly writing, it is still consistent within the realm of this serial killer. So the Sorry Mary letters, again, are Ys that are created with a V shape, and then the stem is put on it at the bottom. These are the more shorter versions of the letter Y because clearly we can see that there's an attempt to use long tails. In the Kern Werewolf, I did actually once again find a Y that was very consistent with Jack's, very consistent with the Lipstick Killers. And then a short... We got about 5 minutes left. And then again, that very short Y. Oh, let me shut that off. That very short Y that we were talking about up here that almost has no stem. And that is consistent also with the Oswald. Now, this curvature of this right arm right here is definitely... we see that Jack also curves that. I'm sorry, right arm. The left arm is curved. Now, this one is pretty much flailed wide open. So the pictorial view of it is not as similar as one would think, but we do have a curvature in the back stem. We have the shorter left arm, and we do have a curvature in it. In the Sherry Jo Bates, we also saw the use of the U-shaped head of the Y that is rounded with the stem, and that again is very consistent with the Lipstick Killer Ys. Very consistent with the Dear Draft Board Ys. Zodiac Killer, moving into that, here again is that very short Y. So that was extremely consistent, once again, with the appearance of disguise that happened in Elizabeth Short's writing, to the very elongated stem of the Y, where the arm is very small and it is a separate stroke. So as we go through here, you'll start to see the Zodiac Ys are very, very consistent with Jack, including the non-attachment of that left arm to the stem. So as we go through, even the slant of these Ys and the direction in which they lay are consistent. We do have some that have the curvature to the right, which tells me that we're on the right track because we are seeing the natural curvature that is happening in Jack's handwriting. Fairfield letters had both the short Y with a short stem, also this very funky Y. Once again, like I'd said, that is Lipstick Killer, that is Jack. We find that all over the place. Kern, the head of that is found in the Dear Draft Board letters. Again, the slant of these Ys are very consistent, and we do know that Fairfield letters were written by the Zodiac, so this is just another style that he uses that we can count on and cross-reference with the rest of the letters. Again, DC Freeway Phantom, we have a very interesting construction, but what I found was that construction was extremely consistent with Oswald, where we had the straight line of the stem and we had that curved arm that is attached by a secondary stroke, but then we see that he actually moves into some of these U-shaped versions once again. So whether or not this is part of the disguise, we see that he's still attempting to disguise in different ways. And in fact, I should have circled this one right here because it has, again, that very short stem. So that one is consistent with the Zodiac Killer and any other short stem Y that we see, Elizabeth Short or otherwise. DB Cooper also had that very wonky looking Y that has been found so far several times. The head of the very tiny little Y with the long curve in the tail, again, is kind of consistent with what we were seeing going on in the Dear Draft Board, where we had the tiny little top heads, but then the very long tails. Also, Dear Draft Board used the what I call the short Y with a very short tail. So we see that that is happening more than once. And again, you can, some of these might even have more consistency with others. I just didn't circle them all. We do see the Y in the DB Cooper that is the top portion that is made separately from the stem on the bottom, which is definitely consistent with the Dear Draft Board. Again, that short stem Y. The Albany letter, again, two-stroke Ys that are made, the arms that are not touching the stem. The SLA also had that very funky Y that we talked about up there in the Lipstick Killer and Jack's. Well, we've got 1 minute, Nolan. That pretty much sums it up. I thought we might make it to the Z. We got really close, you guys. We will finish off the letter Y, the letter Z, and then the punctuation next week, and hopefully be back into the communications of the Zodiac Killer himself and what Jack is up to at that time. Is there anything you'd like to add, Nolan?
Nope.
Awesome. Well, I hope you have a wonderful week and weekend, and we will see you next Friday.
It's graduation party for my cousin's daughter in Bakersfield.
That's right.
Graduation. Beer, food.
Oh, so jealous. So jealous. It is graduation week. That's right. Everybody's going to be graduating. There's going to be a whole lot of stuff going on. Well, everybody take care and happy graduation to anybody who's graduating, you guys. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye, Nolan.
Oh,